The Global Times wrote an article criticizing Dr. S. Jaishankar, India's foreign minister, but deleted the English version just a few hours later. China recently extradited a Khalistani terrorist. And the Maldives, which is a Chinese vassal, has started engaging with India again, even after pro-China government. Yes. What's cooking between the two nations, India and China? And editing this later on 13 September because of a few developments, Mr. Doval, India's national security advisor, met with China's foreign minister, Mr. Wang Yi, and both of them issued a joint statement for resolving the Ladakh standoff urgently. Urgently being the operative word here. The US has started to counter this by sanctioning Chinese companies for the involvement in the temporary nation's ballistic missile program. And the Americans are offering their 50-year-old F-16 jets to India. What's your thoughts on this? Is RIC really a possibility because of threats from Uncle Sam? Lots happening. So you've done a good job of outlining what's happening. The Global Times has historically been. So what is the Global Times? It's a Chinese publication. They are active on Twitter and they have their own website. Twitter generally tweets excerpts of what they or abstracts of what the articles are, and they link to the articles on the Global Times website. And it's a Chinese government mouthpiece, just like the BBC is a British government mouthpiece, and the New York Times, Washington Post, etc., are American government mouthpieces. So every nation typically has one. India doesn't have it. Of course, India is okay. Let's not go into that matter. So the Global Times is one of the Chinese government's mouthpieces, publications, right? And historically, they've had a rather strident anti-India tone, the Global Times and their publications. Okay. So recently, this article came out criticizing India's foreign minister, Dr. Jaishankar, and a few hours later, the article vanished. It was pulled out. It was deleted from the Twitter account and from the website itself. So that's interesting. Why did they delete an article that's critical of the Indian foreign minister? Interesting. The Chinese recently extradited a Khalistani terrorist to India. That's incredible. That's unheard of. China cooperating with India in matters of terrorism, unheard of. First in history, I'm sure. What's going on? And Maldives has a pro-India government. Their leader Mr. Muizu, has had this anti-India campaign, India out campaign. He's known to be a pro-Chinese politician. So there's a pro-Chinese government in the Maldives, and they, after Mr. Muizu came to power, he ordered the eviction of Indian armed forces personnel, a small number that we had, and the withdrawal of Indian companies, and so much more. So and yet now the Maldives is cooperative with India. It's engaging with India. It's awarding projects to Indian companies. All of a sudden, this volte-face has happened. This complete U-turn has happened. So what's going on is the question. What's going on between India and China? And uh, India's NSA, Mr. Doval, met with the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, who's a very high-ranking leader, very high-ranking official. They issued a joint statement. There is talk of resolving the Ladakh standoff urgently. It started because of Chinese actions. Entirely Chinese created crisis. Obviously, we know that. Now, about 75% of it seems to have seen complete disengagement. About 25% is left, but hopefully that also gets disengaged. So you will have a return to relative normalcy on the India-Tibet border in Ladakh, in the Ladakh region. Something is afoot between India and China, clearly. And the Americans now have sanctioned some Chinese companies for their involvement in Pakistani ballistic missile program. It's so funny. The Americans have propped up Pakistan forever, but they're sanctioning Chinese companies for their involvement in the ballistic missile program. And the Americans are offering F-16 fighter planes to India. India should not take those. Those are, well, look, the F-16 program is about 50 years old. It doesn't mean the fighters they are offering to India were constructed 50 years ago. There'll be new jets constructed anew with reasonably good technology, more modern technologies, etc. But you don't want to be part of to have US weaponry, because it gives them immense control over your military, as the Australians discovered with the with the F-15s, which refused to lock onto targets the Australians wanted them to lock onto. You don't want to be saddled with a bunch of crippled aircraft. You don't want that. So, so obviously, India, if India has any sense, will pass on the offer of F-16s. So the Americans clearly are sensing that something is cooking between India and China, and they are trying to, well, make some moves accordingly. So that's the deal. So the final question that Herschel is asking is RIC really a possibility because of threats from Uncle Sam? So RIC is a coalition of Russia, India, China. That's what RIC is. Now, Russia and India are on excellent terms. No concerns there. There's a significant amount of convergence and convergence when it comes to the national interests of Russia as well as India. Russia and China get along reasonably fine. They have this cooperation that's been going on for quite some time. A modus vivendi of sorts they have. And then there's India and China. India and China share a long undemarcated border because the Chinese have steadfastly refused to demarcate the border. And that's the crux of the issue. And the Chinese claim more Indian territory, which is the root cause of all the hostility and the bad blood between the two nations. And they have this practice of salami slicing, attempting to salami slice into Indian territory, cross over the perceived line of actual control, and so on and so forth. Chinese aggression. That's why there is this issue between India and China. The question is, can RIC happen? First of all, why should RIC happen? Why should India, China, Russia come together? The answer is very simple. All three are being targeted by the US. Russia is facing the brunt of the whole gamut of US sanctions right now. China is involved in a trade war with the US. The Americans are denying China various kinds of technology. The Chinese are retaliating in kind when it comes to rare earth metals and whatnot. Um, Chinese want Taiwan. The Americans are propping up Taiwan and so much more, right? So China is facing the heat from the US. Russia is definitely facing the heat from the US. And when it comes to India, the Americans are trying to create all kinds of problems with vis-a-vis India. They've effected a regime change in East Pakistan. They are in the process of attempting to create an artificial cookie nation, Christian nation, cookie land in India's far east, out of Manipur, Mizoram, and Burma, and parts of Bangladesh, parts of all these territories. That's extremely hostile action. The Americans are indulging in subnational diplomacy and trying to destabilize India through that. So much more. They have so many fronts open. They are funding industrial scale Christian conversions in various parts of India. So much more the Americans are doing. India, China, Russia, all three are facing the heat from the US. When it comes to India, the Americans see India as a future long-term threat if India is allowed to grow. So the growth must stop. So India needs to be destabilized in a variety of ways. That's what they're working on right now. It's quite evident, it's quite open, it's quite blatant actually. So all three big nations, Russia, India, China, the three eastern nations, are facing the heat. Makes sense to come together. And the regime change in Bangladesh, in East Pakistan, has affected China, definitely. China had their own thing going on over there. Over the regime change in Pakistan, West Pakistan, which happened in 22, turned a Chinese vassal into a US vassal. That's a big loss for China. So they lost East Pakistan as well as West Pakistan. East Pakistan was never really theirs, but they had reasonably okay relationship with Sheikh Hasina's government. Then there's a civil war in Burma, which essentially can be seen as a proxy tussle between the US and China. So the existing Burmese government, the legacy Burmese government, has historically been pro-China, and the Americans have made big inroads there through the cookie terrorists and whatnot. So that's a big setback for China. So that's the situation. So it makes sense for RIC to happen. The three Eastern powers cooperate and pool their resources to some extent together, and that will enable them to withstand the Western pressure better. That's the kind of thing. If it happens, it's in the very, very early stages, if it is going to ever happen. First of all, the question is, how can India ever trust China after all the backstabbing and everything China has done since the 1950s? China simply can't be trusted. So then how can RIC happen? Well, if the Chinese want India's trust, they will have to demonstrate that they are worthy of trust, and India will have to take it on a step by step, case by case, day by day basis. The crux of the matter is the border, which the Chinese have refused to demarcate. The first step is disengagement, which is happening. Very surprising, but it's happening. Next, I think the border demarcation will take time, even if it's done urgently. May take months, maybe take a few years, perhaps 2 3 years. But as a confidence building measure, India and China could do a pilot project somewhere in the neighborhood, let's say, and kind of defang some snakes. So that's something we could do, perhaps. So that's all I'll say about that. Neighborhood, common neighborhood, India, China. Maybe. Let's see.